Welcome, everybody. We're going to be looking at the activity streams document that we've been working on. I do actually have a fresh copy of it because it's a major change from the last change that was made. We'll just go over to that document. The major changes, actually, I'm going to switch over to here real quick. The major changes since last time we talked about, well, I took a closer look at Getty. And so those first 2 points are from looking at Getty's and the way they implemented. They basically start their activity stream as a whole as an ordered collection. And then they have a whole series of ordered collection pages that link from that main entry point activity stream. On each page, that's where you'll see a bunch of activities, and then they link out from their activities to the actual object and the activity itself, but the activity itself is just a repetition of what's in the stream. So that's not really additional information. So that's just a little background on where the two first bullet points come from. And then after that, we talked about last time moving even closer to the standard. The activity types, they were named like create entity, delete entity, and update entity. And I've moved those to be the core activity types of create, delete, and update. I will note that there is a question about whether it should be create versus add or delete versus remove. So we can potentially talk about that today and what the difference between those are, so we can sort of settle on which would be most appropriate. To be consistent, I changed the extended activity types to be deprecate, merge, and split instead of deprecate entity, merge entity, and split entity. The last major piece from last time is we had the RDF patch and the sparkle right in the activity change document. I have moved those out. So there's an instrument property that points to where that RDF patch or sparkle is. You can link to it. If you don't want to actually use that to update your local cache, then you just would read the main activity stream and not reach out to those additional instrument documents. To bring everybody up to where the document is now, I do have examples. So this is what the entry point looks like. One of the things, let's see, there's a couple of things in here that I have questions about and want to run past you as I was putting them together. As we go through these, you'll see ID over and over again. That is a URL. The ID is self-referential. So if you were on the activity stream's main entry page looking at it and you click the ID, you would be on that exact same page. So it's self-referential. As we get down to the first and last with their links, they're going to one of those activity stream pages, which will have a collection of activities. And we'll look at that a little more just to make sure everybody's on the same page with that. But the question I had in this particular part of the document is the URL that, as I've stated it as a convention, would be a URL to the baseline download for a particular date and time. And the idea would be that if you downloaded everything at that URL and then started applying all the patches that are in this particular activity stream, then you would be up to date as best you can be. The idea is I put a date in here to give a pattern where this is my authority and this is a date that I did a baseline download. And I may have other baseline downloads with a different date, and they would have their own activity stream. So each baseline download would have its own activity stream so that you could be following it through. So I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that, because that's not really in the standard per se, and I don't see Getty doing that. I am definitely open to feedback on that particular approach.
Hi, Lynette, this is Kevin. I don't know if I have a specific comment on that. I have to think about it a little bit more, but we hit this too, and we're trying to figure out what to do with it. And our approach at this time is to think of the ID as an HTTP URI. So it's just a URI. And actually we're staying away from URL. But the URL would probably be the same as the ID with a .json ending. So one of the things that we were toying with on our side with these values is using an HTTP URI as the ID. And if you hit the ID, the default would be to redirect you to a JSON, technically a JSON LD, serialization of the activity streams, in which case the URL would be the same as the identifier, the ID, but with .json on the end. We're taking this approach because in theory, I don't know if I think most is to keep the door open to this, but in theory, activity streams are JSON LD. So they're RDF, they're serialized as JSON LD, but in theory, they could be serialized as RDF XML or some other RDF serialization, and we're just trying to keep the door open to that. So if someone were to ask for application RDF XML, we could give them an RDF XML representation of it. So like I said, on the same topic, but not necessarily specific to what you're referring to. But I actually personally, I find the inclusion of ID in URL to be a little confusing. I feel the ID is the identifier of the activity stream, independent of its document format, and the URL represents its document format. So that's what I gleaned from the documentation also.
Yes,
so I'm not entirely sure if this would work out.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because one of the other thoughts I had in the previous documents, we had an author on individual activities, and I sort of took that out, was rethinking it. Getty does not use that in theirs. It seemed like a lot of repetition, but perhaps this is a place where author could reside. Author here would be pointing back to the authority itself and whatever URL that you want to give it. I don't really see like a way to sort of document that here's the full download. So it would be more of a convention than, you will see that I actually added a column over here called conventions, which establishes some things that may not be specifically part of the specification, but are something that we're sort of counting on happening in a particular way. So if the shift here, so let me just say what I heard you saying, just to be sure I understood it first, and then I'll describe my shift a little bit. So from what I heard, you see ID the same as where it's self-referential to this page, and the URL would be like have the same ID but with like a .json, so it would be in like a different format.
Yes, that's what we're toying with right now.
Okay, so and that would be fine if something like that were the case. Then the piece that I would wonder about would be, could we use the author at this location to be a pointer to the base download, or documentation about where you would get the base download or something like that? Does base download even make sense? It's one of the things we talked about last time.
This is Vitus. I think it makes sense if the authority offers a periodic full download version, and then the activity stream would be the delta of that particular version of the authority. But I'm wondering whether there might be a situation where the authority source doesn't offer a base download or a periodic full update download.
So, I mean, the users of this data are going to need to get to this authority stream. It strikes me that the base download link better resides there with the documentation of how to consume the authority stream rather than embedding it in the authority stream. I guess I'm just thinking about why it needs to be so self-descriptive, given that somebody has to connect to it in the first place.
That makes sense. I guess on some level, sometimes people stumble across things like an activity stream, and I guess I'm looking for a way that would send them back to something that would allow them to know what's the fuller context of this activity stream. There, and speaking of that, there is a context property as well. So something like that could be put into play. But along the lines of what you're saying, Dave, is that we could, in that author that points back to the authority, it could be that that URL is to the documentation. And that would give them that way back to understand what they've got, what have they stumbled across, where can they get more information on it. For example, I have the link to the Getty activity stream, but I do not have a link to the Getty's documentation about their activity stream. And so I make a lot of assumptions about what I've got when I get there. And so just having something that would go back to documentation just feels more complete to me.
Hi, Lynette. This is Amanda. I think as a cataloger who's not well sort of versed in like JSON and other computer things, I'm not sure, like, I think where the ID goes to is going to depend on who you think your audience is. Because I know if this were me and I was going in and saw like ID to lead me to somewhere, I would expect that to lead somewhere where I would get instructions. So having it be self-referential, I think would be frustrating for someone like me who only has like a very slim grasp on any of this. Now, if you think this is, basically going to be used by people who are, sort of like IT folks, that might be a different thing. But I think if it's going to be useful for sort of what I think of as sort of the regular librarian out there, or at least, I mean, I like to think I'm fairly computer savvy and can figure things out, but I think that having it go to somewhere that's actually helpful for sort of saying, okay, this is what you need to do, or this is what this is probably more useful. So if any of that makes sense. I admit I'm really in over my head here.
Sure, and I think that's part of the reason why I'm looking for something that would take you back to documentation, because I do think that a lot of the activity stream is designed to be processed more by computers than humans. I mean, you could certainly scan through it, but it's pretty densely packed with information. I mean, the information is not really necessarily easy for a human to read. And
yeah,
as we move through the other levels of it, you will see it doesn't really get much easier to understand what's happening there. Because I don't think it's really oriented towards a human.
Yeah. I mean, that was kind of my assumption, but I guess that's why I just wanted to. I'm always sort of the engineer to the sort of theoretical physicist. So it's like they have great theories and then I'm like, okay, but how does this work? And so I'm always kind of going back to like, okay, so who's using this? What is the purpose? And who needs to be able to actually understand what's going on in this? So if it's mostly machine readable, or it's meant to just be read by machines, it probably doesn't matter all that much as long as the machine can make some kind of sense out of it. But if it's going to be used by folks, who are, out there trying to, use this for a tool or something, then I think there has to be some built-in, like, this is what you do and this is what you do next kind of thing. And this is where this leads to.
Yeah, I wonder if others have a perspective on like what they would expect how this to be processed, because the fact that I say it's machine readable, that's just sort of like my perspective on it. I would expect to have tools that would process this as opposed to looking at it directly.
I'd like to expand a little bit on my earlier comment. Like at Stanford, we have a cache copy of LC authority records that we have used. But we don't like regularly refresh it, and we don't have the full thing. We just have the headings that we have used, and each record has its own like last update date and all that sort of information. But like the last time we refreshed our authority file, probably many years ago. So if LC starts wants to publish an activity streams of their authority file, would someone in our situation be able to make use of that activity stream without like downloading the entire LC authority file and start afresh?
Hey, Kevin, I wonder if you have some thoughts on that.
This is an interesting question also to complete our flow with authority. So to be sure that we can, or to ask if we can use this kind of activity stream or atom feeds to receive update without download the dump for libraries. So probably Kevin has to answer.
Yeah, I think I'm struggling because I feel like what you're trying to do, Lynette, is something that activity streams is resisting a little bit. And what I mean by that is, so I look at the definitions of these properties and how they're used, and I'm with respect to activity streams. So the identifier that we're looking at is the identifier for that particular thing. So that's the identifier in the example on your screen. That's the identifier for the ordered collection. And according to the activity streams vocabulary, the URL is technically a link, and it is where you can download or otherwise acquire the thing identified with the ID, which happens to be an ordered collection, not all of the updates of the full download. You see what I'm saying? What I feel like is, I understand what you're trying to do. You're trying to say, you know, here's the whole thing. But my reading of the activity streams documentation is that URL is the URL of the ordered collection, not designed to be where you would fetch the full download. I know I'm not addressing Vitas's point, but that's mostly because like I said, I think that my feeling is the way you want to use URL here is not the way activity streams intended to be used.
Sure, and I I think I'm going to definitely look at it deeper, the documentation and everything, because if that's the reading of it, then that's not what we should be using. And I will look at the other things that I've mentioned, potentially looking at context or the author property. I do see that there was a question around whether or not you would need a full download in your local cache to be able to make use of the activity streams. That's the way I sort of understood the question. Is there any use for activity streams by themselves without having a full download that you're going to process it with? And the context there that I heard from Vitus was that they only have cached subject headings that they actually use, and so that's really the context of what they're looking for, to see updates for those kinds of things. And potentially, I would assume some new stuff that they might be wanting to use. But the bigger question that I'm hearing is, can you use activity streams outside of having a full cache?
I would say yes, why not? In other words, imagine was one day you wanted to start, taking in the subject headings from LC, but you didn't care about having all the previous names. Imagine how to say this. Imagine you're starting a library in which you're only going to have items published after the time that the library started. So in that sense, you wouldn't need any of the old names unless they were updated. Well, I guess you would need some old names if it's a previously published author, but where I'm going with this is I could probably easily come up with a use case where you don't need a full data set prior to consuming an activity stream.
But if the starting point of the activity stream is the date of the most recent base download, then you would have to establish that baseline of, which of the time period or the particular download that this activity stream should be applied to. And in our case, we don't have such a thing. The authority records will cache on a ongoing basis, cumulatively, and not via a one particular download point.
So I do know the context for wanting the one particular download point is that if you start from a point in time and then you start processing an activity stream, there's potential for things to get out of sync if you just miss something or misprocess something. And so by having a point in time when there is a sort of pin in the ground of a base download, you can say, well, if I made any mistakes, I'm not going to worry about it because I'm going to take a whole download and then start processing the new activity stream from there. So that's sort of the context behind suggesting that we have this concept of regular base full downloads. It's a little bit different, I think, from the scenario you're describing, Vitus. And I would still think you would have like a point in time when you last updated the subject headings that you have, and then you'd be watching the stream from that date to see if there's been any changes to it. I mean, that's what I would imagine would happen.
Yeah, that's correct. I think we have that information at the record level, but not at the authority file level. Each record has a last update date. So if the activity streams specifies that this activity is being applied to a authority record that has this last update date, then it would be possible to compare it to the version that we have and determine whether this activity is appropriate for the cache copy that we have.
The only thing about that is you would have to basically enforce that the baseline releases contain no data that did not appear in the activity stream prior to it. In other words, if they tweak data as part of the new baseline, you're potentially going to be missing data. All you're looking at is the activity stream. Now, Vitus, I mean, if you've got a timestamp on that activity stream, you would be able to tell that you've got a problem, but the only way you could fix it is to grab the full download.
Or to grab the latest version of that authority record. Other than update it, let's say, because I don't have the, my version is already out of date according to, the activity stream. So I cannot simply update my copy by applying the activity that is in the activity stream. I have to get them a fresh copy of the latest version of that authority record.
Yeah, but that presumes that there's a service that gives you the full graph for a given authority too. That's outboard of the full release.
Sorry, can I have a question? Can I ask for a question? Because I want to be sure that I understood the general usage of activity stream instead of to have a dump. Can we affirm or not that with activity stream we can be update not only about a subset of the whole for example, Library of Congress name authority file dump, but also in a real time respect to a full dump. So the usage of an activity stream can be the ability to have only update entities or heading. The headings to which I'm interested to, and to have this information about update in a sort of real time, not waiting for a refresh of the dump, is correct or not?
So I will say from my perspective, theoretically, I would say that the activity streams gives the potential to have things really up to date. Of course, it's going to depend on the implementer and, how often do they update their activity stream? Do they update it hourly? Do they update it instantly? Do they update it, once a month? So you're going to still have the same kind of lag that you might have in other ways, but it wouldn't be as big a lag as waiting for like a full download to be able to process that, because those have a tendency to be months apart sometimes, if not 6 months apart. So the idea here is that it would be much more up to date than taking a full download. Is that the question you were asking?
Yes, exactly.
And Kevin, I don't know, you guys are farther along in actually trying to do this. So how is this playing out at Library of Congress?
Well, it's pretty early days right now. I mean, we're making the assumption that, if you would have the full download to begin with, and all we're doing is publishing, this was added, or this was modified, or this was removed, or this was created. Nothing more complex than that.
Yes. So given that, I think I'm gonna move forward a little bit to give a little more context to what this looks like in usage, because that'll definitely highlight some of what Kevin was just saying. So what we're looking at here is the entry point to the full activity stream, and you see that it has a first and a last, and they're pointing to ordered collection pages. And in my examples, I structured the URLs that take you there to be basically matching the URL for the full activity stream, except it adds on page 1. And so you can see page 1 is the first, page 12 is the last. I use the publish date to identify when those pages were published and available as part of the activity stream. We're going to come back to dates in a little bit, because there's a question about those as well, but I'm not going to muddy the waters with that just yet, so we can sort of see how the whole operates. So then the other piece is the last, which takes you to the most recent page, and that in this case is page 12. And so the publish date for the first and the publish date for the last sort of give you the time frame of this particular activity stream. That's the time period that it covers. So if we go down and we actually look at the ordered page, you will see that as we move through this, all the examples I have a part of, and that part of is going to take you back a level. So you can always navigate down and navigate back up from any page. So this is taking you back to the entry point of the activity stream. And the ID, of course, is self-referential again here. So it's saying this is page 2, I'm page 2. I selected page 2 in the example so I could do a previous and next, because if it's page 1, there is no previous. If it was page 12, which was our last page, there would be no next. So by selecting page 2, I have a previous and next. And so you can always move forward or backward through the set of pages to get to what you want. And so then what the items within the activity stream look like. So a page will be a collection of activities. And so I didn't update this. I've been changing these, so there's going to possibly be, that's because I was over here. Sorry. That just jumped. So let me go back to where I was. I was gonna just fix this so it doesn't say entity. Okay, so this has 2 activities in it. Frequently, there'd be a whole bunch of activities on any given page, and I just did 2 to keep the example small. So I've got a create activity and a deprecate activity, and you will see that they are ordered items, and they're ordered because you are expected to start at the top and process them down so that if something needs to be created before it's referenced somewhere else, it will exist. So the thing you'll notice is that there's nothing in there about what gets added as part of that create. It just says that a create happened, and this ID is actually the ID in the repository. So that would be like LC's subject heading ID that you could go to actually see the subject heading data. And then it gives a type as well. And so then we have a deprecate, and it has the create and an update to actually do the deprecate. But that's all it tells you. So you don't get any of the details of what is required in order to make the create happen or make the update happen. But if we go down to an individual page, so if we clicked on one of the IDs within that to take you down to the actual activity. So this is a create activity, and you will see it's still very simple. The only thing that's different from here to the previous, and maybe this shouldn't be different, maybe the instrument should be there, but this instrument was not listed up above, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, so I didn't list the instrument up above, so that's a question. Should it be in both places so that these things are identical, or is that considered a streamlined version up higher? The other difference is this now has the part of, which points back to the page, but this instrument is pointing to an object that is of type RD patch. And if you go down to the RD patch, then it's got its part of it points back to the activity, but it's also got the RD patch that you can apply. And so until you get to this level, you won't see anything. And each of these are separate documents. So this is a separate document, and all you would see if you were on this particular, if you had clicked on this URL, all you would see is everything from here to here. And to see the patch, you would click on this URL, and then you would see everything from here to here. So, and it's basically this sort of drill down with the potential to drill back up if you want. But so what Kevin was saying is that the level that LLC is doing it is basically to this level, or maybe not even to this level. I don't know if you're planning to be able to click into it. Getty lets you click in. It could be stopping at just this page level so that you see them all listed there without any of the details of how to implement it. Is that correct, Kevin?
That is correct. We're stopping at the page level. So you see the list of ordered items and do what you will from there.
And I know that we talked last time about that some authorities may not have any more details to be able to construct the instrument. But if they do, and they can, they would be encouraged to do so that full caches would have the content for how they would actually update the cache. So I guess any questions about that kind of covers it from head to toe. I mean, we're not looking at each of the individual types of activities at this point, and we can go through those, but they're really similar to what we looked at last time.
I have a question about the type of the object. I think in the previous version of this document, the examples didn't have any type. And then the property or the activity type extension has something like create an entity, deprecate entity, which I thought was kind of mixing two things together. And so I'm glad that you, in this version, you are separating the activity from the type of the object, because I think entity, I interpreted like create entity. The create is the activity. The entity is the type of object that is being created, being an entity description. But in this current version, I see that the object type is term. And is that the object, the only object type in for everything that we are concerned with? Or can there be more specific object types?
There absolutely can be more object types. So all the examples I give are in sort of like a hierarchical term vocabulary type thing. So that's why I selected term. But if what you were processing was a person, then the type can be person or place or subject. So whatever's appropriate for that particular authority is what that type would be. Having that type on the object is not required, but several people made comments that they like the idea of having the type of the object present on the object document.
Yeah, I think if the idea is that the activity stream is a kind of notification document that someone or system, some system can pause to identify particular things of interest, then having specific object type could help in that kind of activity, or in that kind of using this data. And when I think about the object type that we have talked about, I'm in particular thinking about the difference between entity and authority. And I'm wondering whether there is any need for differentiation between the two.
I wonder if you could say a little more about that. I asked that because when I think of entity, I think of that as like all that bottom line stuff we finally get to where we have a thing. I think of that as an entity. So whether it be a term or a person or a place, once you get to the specific subject that I think of that as being the entity. And so I may not be thinking of it as quite the same way you are.
Yeah, I'm thinking of it in terms of like when you add a URI to a heading in a MARC authority record, there is a subfield 0 and then there's a subfield 1. In the subfield 0, we would put the URI for the LC authority record. So when I say authority, that's what I'm referring to. And what we put in the subfield 1 is the description of the real entity, the real world object. And so there is a difference in terms of the different kinds of purpose of the two type of objects. One is an authority record that has its own set of objectives, and then the other is a description of an entity, which is a different kind of thing than an authority. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, that gives me the context. Thanks. So I know that a lot of the authorities don't have a real world object and an authority record, they just have one. But I also know that, we work extensively with LC names, which definitely has both perspectives, the real world object and the authority. So I guess, Kevin, I would punt back to you again and ask, how are you guys representing that in your activity stream? What are you thinking about doing there?
I missed a little part there. What is the that?
Can I ask it a different way?
Sure.
Or sort of related, but so it sounds like we might need streams for concepts versus real world objects. And so I think that was Vitus's question was, would there be separate streams for the different entities, given that they have different RDF descriptions. And then maybe I'll wait for I'll ask my second question after that one. I think that's, sorry, Vitus, if I got that wrong, but.
No, that's exactly right. That's exactly my question.
I personally think that's up to the publisher to some degree. I can certainly say that we're not opposed to providing separate streams, one for RWOs and one for authorities, where we make that distinction. What I will say though is that we're not technologically in a position to do that really easily right now, though. But that has a lot to do with how we store our RWOs. I won't go into details, but they're a little faked. We surface them, but they're not quite the same thing as everything else in the system, which would make us publishing a separate stream for RWOs a little challenging, but not impossible. But then getting back to the main point, I just simply see that as a publisher decision, unless it would be an expectation if working in this environment, for example. We make it an expectation.
Yeah, my other question was generally for LC, and I think this would apply for other data publishers, just generally organizing activity streams. Would you, and maybe this comes down to locally how you're pulling off your RDF management, but in getting back to the activities we see on the screen, whether or not type would be used to denote different class types or different data sets. So you might have a concept, or you have SCOS concepts in all your different data sets. If you're publishing a single activity stream of all your data sets, having a type concept might not be as helpful as also including the source. So maybe this is how you organize and listen to activities streams based on different, it might be best practice to have different activity streams for different data sets rather than lumping them all into one big stream. So like LCSH separate from LCNAF.
I definitely.
Right.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that. So just as an example here, I just love pop that in the chat. So that, for example, is the address, for example, to our current Atom feed updates. And where I'm going with this is you can see that the URL or the access point for the Atom feed is directly underneath the scheme, so to speak. So I can tell you that the way we're doing activity streams, I can't remember exactly how it is right now. I think we're doing something like this. I'm not the one actually doing the work, so I'm not 100% sure, but it was something like, I think it's something like that. So if you wanted to just have the subjects, you would do something like this. So I think that this is why I say partly to me this is up to the publisher unless we specify it and would codify it in some way so that it becomes an expectation. But Steve, I think that this is what this is kind of where you're going, for example.
Right, and I was about to put this in the chat, but it's just easier to say out loud. So from authorities/names, you might use, I'm not suggesting without more discussion that this should in fact be the case, but that for type, for a stream that's for names, you might have organizations as a type and persons as a type and name titles as a type, so that somebody could, if they weren't interested in caching name titles, for instance, they could just ignore those activities.
Yeah, I definitely, that is the direction I was going with that. If you look at in the examples where I give an example of the properties, I do put person, place, and term is in there since I was using it in this document, but that would be based on the authority provider, what they would determine those potential object types are. But I definitely would see it for being used in the way that you were describing, Stephen.
And I would expect, I would say that we should make that an expectation of whatever comes out of this group, that, you are strongly advised to include the object type in the output, precisely to give people the ability to either consume it or drop it, depending on what they want. So for example, if you went to activity stream /authority/names, page 1, and you were just interested in the name titles, you could filter on that object type and then drop everything else.
Yeah, and what I like about that, regardless of your engineering problems with how real world objects are stored and created versus other things, is if you had a type concept that was separate from your RWO classes, you could sort of build that in, that if the library was more interested in keeping $0s versus $1s, they could start to, if assuming you were to solve the engineering problem, they could do that. They could grab the identifier they want and cache the data that they want. Because my understanding, at least with RWOs that have concepts, is there are some changes that trigger a change in both the concept and the RWO, and some changes that only trigger a change in the concept or the RWO. So. Bringing it back to Vitus is a good question about the $0.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like the example of name titles, that's a very authority thing. If you are looking at it as an entity, then, or if you're looking at it from the BibFrame point of view, the name title is a work entity. And so depending on who is publishing the data and what they consider that data to be, it could be quite different. So for instance, ShareVD would have in its cluster knowledge base a lot of descriptions of work entities. So in their publishing of the data, then their typing of the objects that they are publishing could be entity, and their activity stream could be associated with object entities rather than object authorities. And so that brings me back to my original point of whether, if we're thinking about an extension of the authority vocabulary in terms of the object type, whether we need to make some kind of separation between object type authority versus object type entities.
So I guess that's the part, I'm not sure I'm completely following you. So I definitely followed the conversation around authority versus real world object, and that what we actually give as the object type, whether it be a person, a place, or something else, it would be dependent on the authority itself that's implementing it. And so I'm not sure the difference between the question of having an entity type versus an authority type.
It could be.
I think the type would, for instance, if you have a name title, if you have a type that is name title, that is authority oriented, that is referring to an authority record and how the heading is constructed, as opposed to referring to a description of an entity, which is that work. And in for example, in shared VDE, the emphasis is not on the construction of the heading, but on description of the entity. And so in that scenario, the well, what we call the authority source would be a source of entity description. I don't know whether that helps to clarify what I'm thinking about, but that's sort of what's going through my head right now.
But Vitus, it could be that this difference is known is the I don't know how is explained starting from the data set that you are using. So if you are using, for example, ShareVD, you know that the object is an entity, while if you use a data set of authority records, you can understand, you can derive that the activity stream refer to an authority records. So because probably we never use a source that put together authority description with real world object, but the source is targeted as real world object entities data set, or as authority records data set.
Right. What I'm thinking is QA is a tool for catalogers to create a description for resources. And they will be using both authority records and entity description for different purposes. And so QA is going to have sources that encompasses both types of data. And yes, you can kind of infer the type of object that you're dealing with by the source that you're accessing. But I think what this group is thinking about is to come up with some structured way for various authority data publishers to be able to provide update information. And so in that context, whether it would make sense or whether it would be useful or necessary for a source to be able to specify that, okay, the data that we have here is of this type. And right now, the activities streams vocabulary doesn't have a object type that is of this sort. So if we are going to extend that vocabulary in order to fulfill the needs of this community, then do we simply call everything terms, or do we call something authority or something entity, or maybe some other names? I don't know.
So, well, I just want to comment because we're just about out of time. And so I'm wondering if what might help to make this clear is if we had some various examples from known authorities. I wonder, Vitus, if you could, like, you don't have to do like full examples like I have in this document, but if you had examples that list, this is the authority, this is a type that I would see coming from the authority, and this would be more of a specific type, so like a person or something like that. I just, if I could see some examples, I think that might help me to understand how it might fit in this particular infrastructure. And
Sure,
And
I'll try to come up with, this, with some examples to see if that helps clarify the concept.
Yeah, and feel
And-
free to put them in the wiki in a working document, so that more people can add to it too if we want to add some more examples.
And that could be that this is a sort of translation in a term of property for activity stream of the subfield 0 and subfield 1 of Mark 21 that has the same meaning, probably. So just we want to be able to report the same difference that the Mark report using subfield 0, subfield 1.
Okay.
Yeah, I think if we get some examples together, I think that'll just help flesh it out, and it'll certainly make it clearer for me. So I want to thank everybody. I think we have a couple of pending questions based on the conversations today, and I might reach out to some folks just to get some clarity, because I am not particularly clear at this point how to adjust this document. I think we still have some outstanding questions, and maybe we can work on it some offline, and I'll post some stuff in Slack and try and get some clarity from folks. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye.